pull yourself on. You're up by your own moral bootstraps. Every major religion of the world, I want you to hear me clearly now. Every major religion of the world is a works religion. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Sikhism, Baha'ism, Jainism, all of them. You can take every one of them, it has to do with works. In Islam, your entrance into paradise is dictated by your good deeds outweighing your bad deeds. In Hinduism, every birth is a rebirth, and it's on the basis of karma, all that went on before. And your karmic cycle keeps going till you can break off this cycle and attain nirvana or moksha or whatever they want to call it. In the Christian faith, you first of all come, not by virtue of moral capacity, you come by the gift and the grace of God, who offers you forgiveness, and you come just as you are in all of your failings. When the prodigal son comes home in that tremendous parable, it is so counterintuitive within Eastern culture. This boy took the father's money, spent it at a whim, plundered his life, did everything wrong, and he's gone. And now he decides he's going to come home. In Eastern culture, the father would never go out. He's been wronged. He would have to wait till the son came and literally threw himself at his feet and begged for mercy. But in the way Jesus tells the story, the Eastern father would have immediately sort of perked up his ears. The father leaves the porch, leaves the home, runs towards the son and embraces him and receives him. This my son was lost, is found, was dead, is alive. So morality is good living, is the fruit of your conversion and your commitment to Christ. It is not the means of your attaining salvation and attaining rightness in the sight of God. So what are the 10 Commandments all about? They were all about the fact that life is sacred, your word is sacred, your marriage is sacred, your time is sacred, your giving is sacred. And in the sanctity of life, these expressions come. But the 10 Commandments came after the Exodus. Redemption precedes righteousness. It is never the other way around. So God takes a life, puts that life back together, and gives you the fruit of what Michael was talking about. What does the church have to do here? I think the church has to teach us that that inner transformation is desperately needed. Let me say this very carefully. Listen to me carefully now. Malcolm Muggeridge said, "The depravity of man is at once the most empirically verifiable fact at the same time that it is the most intellectually resisted." The depravity of man is the most empirically verifiable fact at the same time it's most intellectually resisted. If a man is stealing nuts and bolts from a railway track, says Dale Moody, and you send him to university at the end of his education, he will steal the whole railway track. Some of the biggest crimes that have been committed against humanity sometimes have been committed by high officers and high success stories. Depravity is here. Transformation, redemption, righteousness, and worship. That's the sequence. Morality alone will never get any one of us anywhere. It may make for some kind of existence, but it doesn't deal with the root of the problem, which is the rebellious heart that needs to be corrected and the heart that needs to humble itself before God. That's my word to you.
What do you say to those who cannot believe in God because suffering exists and cannot believe that a good God would allow suffering?
I would say that's a very good question. Well, maybe just a couple of things, because that's the kind of question that actually demands a very long answer. It might be the case for some people that when suffering comes, it's not simply the case that it may drive them away from God per se. It may simply be a catalyst that reveals to them what they actually thought about God in the first place. So if you find yourself caught up in suffering, you may, for some people, they'll find themselves driven into the arms of God because they believe he's there and he cares. And to others to walk away from the idea of God because they believe either he isn't there or he doesn't care. And so sometimes suffering simply acts as that catalyst. Let me suggest 3 possible things to turn to if you're interested. One of my colleagues, Vince Vitale, who is at Oxford, who's a philosopher who teaches with us, has done his whole doctorate on suffering. And he gave a very brilliant talk on the nature of suffering at Oxford University, in quite a hostile setting, and handled Q&A. It's available online, and I'm sure if you got in contact with our ministry at rzim.org, we could give you the link. Another one of my colleagues, also at Oxford, who's a professor of mathematics, was speaking down in New Zealand shortly after the earthquake there, which devastated the city. He stood in a ruined building, addressing members people who'd all lost family members in that great tragedy, and tried to address the problem there on ground zero. And I also know that Dr. Zacharias is also all the way back to the time when you were in Columbine High School. I know there was a whole series of talks recorded there, one of which was simply why. So I think I'll try to say two things. I'd like to try to say that there's some hope, not just simply existentially in terms of finding comfort with God, but maybe even coming to know that there is God through it. And if you're interested, that question itself probably deserves a much longer answer that could simply be stated here. And if that is your question, you happen to be here, I'm sure we'll be happy to put you in contact with the resources. I think we can make you a promise and say if you're not a Christian and you are wrestling with this issue, then we would like to give you those resources for free. If you are a Christian and you want those resources, you may be tempted to have a small crisis of faith right now. And claim those resources for free, and to you, we'd just like to remind you there will be a day of judgment and accountability. So those aren't for you.
Well, Michael, I'll take two quick stabs at that. Michael was an answer to prayer for long suffering for many, many years, yeah. We travel together and he keeps us all entertained. His wife has only 2 words all the time while we travel. It's, "Oh, Michael, oh, Michael." And then he comes one after another. There's 2 sides to that question. Let me just defang it philosophically and then move quickly to the application. Vince and I are in the process of writing a book together on this. He's just sent me an outline, so that's what I was doing actually last week, Bangkok Take, doing my 3-chapter share of that. Philosophically, it's often, of course, put in tandem with evil. Suffering, evil. Suffering, evil. Why does God even allow evil? And I've often responded that it's very critical to understand the nature of the question. Because when we say there's evil, we assume there's good. When we say there's good, we assume there's a moral law on the basis of which to differentiate between good and evil. When we assume a moral law, we assume a moral lawgiver. Because without the moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. Without the moral law, there's no good. Without good, there's no evil. The question actually ends up hoisting itself on its own petard, as it were. It doesn't know how to defend itself. But here's the killer point of that argument. Somebody may say, why do you need a moral lawgiver to have a moral law? And the answer is very clear in this. Every question raised about evil and suffering is either raised by a person or about a person, which means personal worth is essential to the question. Intrinsic worth is essential to the question. And in a naturalistic framework, you cannot have intrinsic worth. You've got extrinsic worth. It's conveyed to you. You're just a radar blip on the radar screen of time. You just happen to be here. But if you're a person created in the image of God with intrinsic worth, then the question indeed is reflective of the value that you give to personhood. So 2 things, the reality of good and the intrinsic worth of a person are essential to the question. If the question is to be taken seriously, those 2 assumptions need to be made, which the Christian makes. But the 2 points of application I want to make is this. I've lived with serious back problems. That's why it's easier for me to stand also, not just keep seated. With 2 metal rods in my back and 8 screws bolting me down from L3 to S1 from a back injury that I suffered. I've had perfect health in every other way. 40 years of travel. I've never had an upset stomach in 40 years in 70 different countries. No issues of any kind. Those things don't bother me. Yeah, I was raised on the streets of Delhi. My mother said he ate everything, and nothing ever bothered him. There was a kind of place where if you went to eat and you spit in the sink afterwards, somebody would tell you, you went to a distinguished restaurant and did that, what would they tell you? You would tell them, I did go there, and they told me if I wanted to do that, to come here. So this is the kind of food we ended up eating in those kind of settings. Now, what I want to say is this. Through pain, through enduring pain for 27 years, constant pain for 27 years with 3 herniated discs and stenosis, pain going down your leg. You can easily say, Lord, you've called me to travel. You've called me to do this. Why did you give me a body such as this? I have learned what Annie Johnston Flint said, who lived with cancer, blindness, arthritis of the rheumatoid kind, and she was orphaned. He giveth more grace when the burdens grow greater. He sendeth more strength when the labors increase. To added affliction he addeth his mercy. To multiplied trials his multiplied peace. When we have exhausted our store of endurance, when our strength has failed ere the day is half done, when we reach the end of our hoarded resources, our Father's full giving has only begun. His love has no limit, his grace has no measure, his power has no boundaries known unto men. For out of his infinite riches in Jesus he giveth and giveth and giveth again. God sustains you. God empowers you. God enables you, and you draw closer through many of those times of agony. And the one thought I leave with you is this. There's a young gal in Georgia by the name of Ashlyn Blocker. She was featured in a Google picture this last week, and I think Katie Couric is interviewing the parents again. When the baby was born, the mother realized something was wrong because the baby didn't cry. The doctors never diagnosed anything. Everything was fine, till they found out she had CIPA, congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis. She doesn't feel any pain. No pain whatsoever. She could step on a nail, she could put a hand on a burner and not know that her hand is being burned. The mother ended her last interview, the last time I saw when the little gal was only about 10 or 12. She said, every night I go to bed saying, God, please give my little girl the ability to feel pain. In our finite world, if pain is an indicator of something that is wrong and gets us to seek the reality of finding help, is it impossible in the infinite mind of God to use the agency of pain through which to draw us and to bring us to the ultimate corrective? The greatest pain is ultimately that of the soul and the separation from God. So he is able to sustain you both in the physical and emotional struggles and in the deepest pain of all, that spiritual alienation. I'll leave that with you.
At this time, I think we'll be taking our last question, unfortunately, and we'll do it over here at the microphone.
Don't worry, I'll keep this brief. Well, I really respect what you're doing, but I just coming here out of a whim. I was just curious. You speak of tolerance and respectful discourse, and I really want to believe in that. But I was just curious as to your opinion on having what we could say as a respectful discourse as far as like LGBT rights and stuff like that, where it seems like a certain ideology would be have a strong conviction on that, and I want to know what would be a good way to get a good respectful conversation going for more progress in that regard.
I mean, this has become obviously a very big issue, partly because, I think for a variety of reasons, and it certainly isn't helped by the shrill voices on both sides of the debate who actually make having any kind of discourse or conversation even harder. I'm aware a little bit, when I was speaking last in the US at Texas A&M in December, these questions came up, and I had some quite extended conversations for 2-3 hours after the meeting with a certain group of people. They'll talk about it with me, and this is the issue they wanted to discuss with me. And I think the question which American society has before it right now is twofold. One, who informs the moral convictions of a society, and where do they come from? Now, historically in the States, you've been very heavily influenced by the Christian faith and by the Judeo-Christian ethic. And what seems to be happening now is a question of whether that's actually the ethic that American society wants to embrace and to have. So that's going to be a conversation which is going to have to happen here, I guess, both politically as well as within academia and with every level of society. And I think that conversation should be encouraged. I think the next question will then be, what does it mean to have disagreements, and within a civil society, how do you allow that kind of diversity? Now, what I do find interesting about the debate is this. Both in ancient Greece and in Rome, in those societies, homosexual relationships were seen as being purer and higher than heterosexual ones. So the culture as a large had the conviction that homosexual love was of a purer and nobler form than heterosexual relationship. And even if you were married, having a homosexual relationship on the side was seen as being, well, and openly was being seen perfectly acceptable. And in some cases, some of the leaders in those societies would have been openly gay and would have been applauded for it. What I do find interesting, however, is both in ancient Greece and in Rome, there was never any debate about changing the meaning of marriage, for example. So marriage was still classically understood. But even though homosexual relationships were viewed, as I say, as being on a more noble plane. So where I find the debate more concerning is using legislative force to start changing the meaning of words in the dictionary. That is something I find more concerning, and history doesn't seem to tell a very happy story of any society that resorts to legislative force to start rewriting the meaning of words. So I'm wondering if there are ways for this conversation to happen in a way that will take place, in a way that will allow as I say, people to be able to say on both sides what they actually believe and where they think they may be wrong, and then to find a way as a society to live that together. In Europe, we're having similar types of debates, and it's getting complicated. In France and in Germany, there have been debates about how much surgery should be allowed within a gay couple to allow them to have babies and to actually conceive if they're both men, because the technology is there now, but obviously it's very expensive to do that. Should that be permitted or not? And should the taxpayer have to pay for it? And you can imagine these kinds of debates are the kinds of debates that raise a very high temperature in the room. So I think if there's anything that can be done that will both defuse the temperature but also allow an actual discussion of the fundamental issues which are involved, I think they become very important. Another one of our colleagues, Os Guinness, I know in the book that Dr. Ravi referred to earlier, which talks about what we mean by civil society and freedom, I think has some very pertinent things to say into that particular issue and debate, and I feel comfortable with everything that he says there, and I would recommend it to be read. I don't know if there's much more that you would want to say.
I'd like to answer that, and Michael, if I may make a closing statement at that time and then turn it back to you. I want to thank you for that question, and I know in an audience like this there'll be many, many diverse views, certainly polarizing views on it, and so if you're here tonight of a different view and you hold to that firmly, I want to thank you for coming. I want to thank you for giving us a hearing, because it must take a lot of every ounce of your own strength to be seated there listening to maybe a worldview that you're not comfortable with, because it may challenge some of your own worldview or however you want to live your life out. I make a plea in a couple of directions along with what Michael. Our team is based in about 10 countries, and we cover a lot of territory here with politicians, with business people, with academics. And politicians are beside themselves. They really have no answers. One of the political leaders in Africa put his arm in mine after I'd finished addressing the presidents there. He said, "Our cumulative wisdom is unable to meet the daunting challenges of our time. Our cumulative wisdom is unable to meet the daunting challenges of our time." But I want to say this: what we saw on the fiscal cliff is minor compared to what we would see in an amoral cliff. If we ever get to the top there, it'll be the devastation of so much. We go in many hostile settings, many inimical settings. I go in places where I've literally had to have armed guards who are there in case anything happens. I've always made a plea in the following way. The Christian view of marriage that Michael and I would hold is very different to the Islamic view of marriage. In the Quran, polygamy is provided for and allowed for, and it is mandated by their rules, but you can have a polygamous marriage. My own view of that is going back 5,000 years with Abraham, that became one of the factors in which it has created 5,000 years of turmoil in what happened in that household by virtue of what happened in that polygamous relationship and the offspring. And the blood that has been spilled for 5,000 years started as a war between two half-brothers over who had the right to the father's inheritance and spiritual inheritance and so on. But that has not kept Muslim people from inviting me to speak there. Michael is heading out to Cairo next week. This year I was in so many Islamic countries, and I've been in Islamic universities. The Islamic University of Malaysia, one of the oldest Islamic universities, with the sheikh sitting in front of me for a 1.5-hour open forum. I have a differing view on the sanctity of marriage to theirs, but they allow us to come and speak. Same with Buddhists. Buddhist monks have a different view of marriage than the Christian does. So also with the Catholic teaching on celibacy in the ministry, we don't hold to that as Protestant, evangelical Christians and so on. But that does not keep them from inviting us. We go and speak, and cordially we discuss, we disagree, and if we disagree, we do so not compromising our convictions. We'll speak in any settings. I spoke at the Mormon Tabernacle, the first non-Mormon to be invited there in 104 years after D.L. Moody, to speak at that. I don't hold to their view of marriage and so on. We well know that. But we respectfully deal with that. So my plea with the skeptic in these matters is, can we not still talk? Can we not still hear one another? Can you not give the Christian the chance to defend what it is about the sanctity of marriage that we actually see and why it is we hold that view? And wherever society ultimately goes, in an open arena of question, truth will ultimately triumph. Truth will win out, and the lie will be shown for what it really is. We are committed to be followers of Christ, and we will preach His word, and I thank you for giving us that opportunity. Let me just close with this simple illustration. Last year, after 40 years of travel, I experienced something that I hadn't experienced in a long time. I was invited to preach at the Angola prison in Louisiana, which has 5,300 hardcore prisoners. 85% of them are on life without parole. 45 of them are on death row. And you walk in and see 22, 23-year-old men who will never leave the prison, never walk out of there. And they jammed the auditorium when I was there to speak and address the issue of grace and forgiveness and redemption. When you walk past death row, you just go by there and they'll reach their hand out and they will grab your hand and ask you to pray for them. The chaplain, the warden who was there, a man by the name of Burl Cain, the girth of a southern sheriff, he walks like that, you know. He told the prison that he would come if they would let him do it his way. It was the bloodiest prison in the country. Blood marks on the walls, blood marks on the carpets. When you were checked in, you were given a knife to defend yourself. Today, it's the safest prison in the United States after a few years of Burl Cain being there. Bible verses all over the wall. All over the wall. And just before these guys go into the anteroom for their last meal, before they go to the execution, I'll never be the same after seeing that execution chamber. I could not handle it. When they tell you the stories of what happens, they just walk away from it. But I'll never forget sitting at that table, thinking,